Welcome back to The Bulwark Goes to Hollywood. My name is Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at The Bulwark. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by my friend and writer at The Washington Post, reporter on video games, Gene Park. Gene, thank you for being on the show today.
Mr. Sonny Bunch, it's been a few years in the making, but this is the first time we've ever spoken and the first time we're actually able to see each other on camera. For audio listeners, we're actually video chatting here. So long time admirer. You are sometimes quite right.
Oh wow, you're really underselling things here. This is that's not fair. No, I'm really excited to have Gene on because Gene is one of the only people I read on a regular basis on video games. Because I'm not a gamer. I would not describe myself as a gamer, but I do occasionally play video games. I feel like that's an important distinction to make here, to the extent that I started playing the Resident Evil 4 remake last night, Gene, and I had forgotten that first big village fight is not winnable. It's just a timed thing. So I kept getting very, very frustrated, even though I've played this game before, and it was just a reminder that I'm so bad at these things that I should leave it to the pros. But we have Gene on today to talk about video game movies, which is a topic I am really interested in right now because it feels like, and this is what I said to Gene in the pitch to come on the show, it feels like we're at an inflection point with the critical and audience success of The Last of Us, which is, of course, based on a video game, a huge hit on HBO Max, etc. In about a week, we're going to have the new Super Mario Brothers movie, which every box office analyst I've seen thinks is going to do huge, enormous business. I mean, there's no kids movies out. It's going to be a big hit. It feels like we're right at the same moment as we were in 2008 when The Dark Knight and Iron Man both dropped in theaters in pretty short proximity, close proximity to each other, and like completely altered the landscape of movies, the business of movies. I really feel like we're right there for video games. Is that the sense you get too, as a gamer, as somebody who watches both movies and video game and plays video games? Is that the feeling you have?
That actually, it feels very correct. And we were all there during the height of the Dark Knight, Batman Begins and Iron Man and everything. And, it showed kind of two different paths to have comic book movies. I think Hollywood has kind of seen that there's a limit to how many comic book stories you can tell. You can hear that in the discourse about Marvel fatigue. And as a longtime comic book reader, there is a certain point where you kind of just get kind of tired of reading the stories. So I do feel like Hollywood is kind of seeing like, okay, well, maybe what's the next big thing? Video games are clearly much bigger in terms of pop culture impact than comic books. They're a much bigger business than comic books. So how do we start adapting these games into IP, into expandable IP? And so then you get that with The Last of Us with HBO, which was a critical and commercial hit. And I agree with the analysts. I believe Super Mario Brothers movie, there's been talk about how there's very little kids movies out in theaters right now. Super Mario is going to be that movie. And, I expect it to make it a billion dollar box office easily. It's going to be huge. It really goes to they both kind of illustrate a lot of like the path that video game adaptations can take moving forward. The Last of Us is a very linear story, but it was very faithful to the game, and that's something that I think a lot of game players have been asking for, to please just kind of hew close to the source material, and we've not really gotten that. Most recent infamous example, speaking of Resident Evil, is the Netflix show Resident Evil. And there's also the Halo show by Paramount Plus. And both of those properties really, really diverge from the source material to the point where it's pretty unrecognizable. And then you start to wonder, if this isn't going to please the base, would it please the quote unquote broader audience, which is what they were trying to go for. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of why these games were so popular in the first place. And also, we can talk more about it later, but also the difficulty in adapting the video game format to a linear filmic storytelling format.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting to think about the plea from fans for faithfulness to the material because again, this is something that you heard a lot of from people who love comic books and were constantly frustrated by some of the comic book movies that were coming out before the rise of the MCU. I mean, like Spider-Man was pretty faithful to those movies, but then you'll get stuff like The Punisher, right? The Thomas Jane John Travolta Punisher, which like moved the action to Miami. It was like a lot of pastels and hues and stuff, and like people were like, well, why even bother making it a Punisher movie if you're gonna do this? And it is the same thing with video game films. I mean, I do think that you get you if you can't capture that hardcore base of fans, why even bother adapting the material in the first place?
Yes, yeah, exactly. That's what you're catering to. That's the whole reason why you got that IP in the first place, to cater to the millions of fans that already exist. It's already a built-in audience, and it's surprising how many studios could just kind of miscalculate that. But also, again, it goes back to how difficult it is to interpret these games into a movie. Because to be quite frank, a lot of the video game stories aren't really that great in terms of stories. Resident Evil 4, we were talking about Resident Evil 4. The original Resident Evil 4 in 2005, the story was famously written in 2 weeks. And it sure sounds like it. It's about one man being sent into rural Spain to save the president's daughter from a zombie cult. And just right there, you can already tell that it's already been written in 2 weeks. And the director Shinji Mikami also said that the story is not the most important part. It should be fun. The gameplay mechanics should be fun, and it turned out it was. Resident Evil 4 is one of the most influential video games of all time. I like to liken it to the Terminator 2 of video games. Highly influential. And you see that with Resident Evil on Netflix, and they try to tell a whole story, but you see that even in the faithful adaptations of Resident Evil, like the Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City. By the way, I've watched every single video game movie ever made.
Okay.
I actually wrote an article about Oscars, Oscars for video game movies throughout history. And I gave the Resident Evil director Paul Anderson the Best Director award. Because it's Oscars, so you give awards to people when they're like very late in their career, and you're like, okay, well, we forgot about you. Sorry, Jamie Lee Curtis. Here you go.
Well, he also, of course, famously directed Mortal Kombat, the first Mortal Kombat, which I think has been reevaluated over the years. Is now appreciated for the classic that it is. Which is, I mean, faithfulness is an interesting thing because I do think that, look, I think the best example of a video game series that has been faithful-ish but still succeeded as storytelling and as action filmmaking is those Resident Evil movies. I mean, I think that obviously there's it strays pretty far from the games because it's telling its kind of own story, but it still has you still have your little flourishes here and there, but The Last of Us, again, very different. It's a very tight adaptation, very very close to the source.
It reminds me of a book adaptation, like the kind of thing you would see from this is Pride and Prejudice by Kenneth Branagh, and it's a very faithful adaptation to the book or whatever. I don't know if Kenneth Branagh ever did a Pride and Prejudice movie, but you know what I'm saying, right? Like a Kenneth Branagh Shakespeare movie,
Sure.
which are very, very faithful to those books and to those scripts. And I always liken The Last of Us to kind of like a theater production. And that's what they're doing. They made a whole TV production out of it, and they hew very close to the scripted lines. I think a lot of people were quite surprised. People who don't play games were a little quite surprised at the strength of the writing and the emotionality of the characters. And I say, yeah, this game is old. Like we've already kind of gone past this, or have we? I don't know. The Last of Us was quite seminal. So,
well, it's interesting too. I mean, you've now lived through 2 cycles of Last of Us debates with the game when it came out, and now with the show. What was the difference in reaction? Do you think from gamers who played the game and got through the whole thing and got to that last sequence in the hospital, and people who watched it on TV without having played the game? Did you notice any real split in opinions there?
Not really. I do feel like because I was watching a lot of YouTube reactors who had never played the game before, who watched the show. So a lot of the plot twists and events that happened in the game were new to them. So it was interesting to see the reactions, and it was quite similar to the popular reaction to The Last of Us. In terms of they were very surprised, they were very intrigued. They loved talking about and debating the moral ramifications of whatever happened in the finale. We don't have to talk about spoilers, but and it was also interesting because there's been kind of a weird critical backlash against The Last of Us, and I think it's probably because Craig Mazin, the showrunner, has been going around saying this is the greatest video game story ever told, and that's hyperbolic, of course. But it's also fine for someone to believe that because it is a good story. And it's been interesting to see a critical kind of backlash to the game over the years. A lot of game journalists or a lot of game critics don't really hold The Last of Us in that high of a regard. I hold it a little bit higher than they do. It's not one of my favorite games of all time, but I do appreciate what it tried to do for the storytelling of video games. And it was also interesting to see some critical backlash to the show as well, but it was very minimal though. For the most part, a lot of people seem to be very impressed. I think a lot of that came from the strength of the performers. The performers, no matter what you feel about the story, you can't really knock Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey for how they were able to portray the characters. And again, that's how I look at it. I think I feel like that they were putting on a stage play for us. This is the Last of Us, the classic story, and now here it is being performed by these two seminal actors.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about what studios who are looking to make some of these games should be attempting to do, because I mean I do think we have a very good example again of a movie coming up here where the story is not necessarily the biggest part of it. It's based on kind of IP and recognizable figures, and that's the Super Mario Brothers movie. I mean, if anyone who's played Super Mario Brothers, I played Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, 3. Growing up, those were my games. It's a simple game. It's a lot of jumping, a lot of breaking blocks. There is a story. It's a very basic story. It's save the princess, save the world, and obviously there's been more Super Mario Brothers games over the years that have kind of built the mythology or whatever, but you don't need to do what the live action movie did, which is invent a whole bunch of nonsense. There's enough basic story there to just kind of use what they have, right? Is that what studios should be trying to do here? Is to stick to what has worked in the games without I guess without I don't know how you do that without having the playability factor, I guess is my question here. I mean, is there something inseparable of the video game experience in terms of playing and watching?
Yeah, I think it goes to a certain type of feeling. From what I haven't seen the Mario movie yet. I do plan to see it pretty soon, coming up in a preview. Pre-screening, and I haven't seen it, but what we've seen so far, it seems to really capture the kind of the spirit or the feeling of Mario more than you're right that Mario doesn't really have a story, and it's been very, very much like Resident Evil. It's been very much deprioritized in terms of making the games. The game is more about a feeling, like feeling joyful, feeling fun, feeling playful. And I think that's what a movie like the Mario movie should do, and that's why the Sonic the Hedgehog movies were so successful, even though they didn't. Sonic the Hedgehog again is a very similar story to Mario. Like your Sonic is rescuing the animals from the evil robot doctor, right? And they managed to kind of turn it into kind of like a joyful, innocent story about like doing the right thing and everything. Obviously, it's a very kids movie and it's a very simple message, but like that message was very simple and it resonated very strongly throughout the entire themes of the movie, in terms of the performances. I'm forgetting his name. Who was the star of the Sonic movie? But the guy who plays Cyclops.
Jim Carrey. James Marsden.
James Marsden,
Yep.
the poor cowboy who dies in Westworld. Sorry for Westworld spoilers. And Jim Carrey as well, and they both were able to kind of capture the innocence and energy of the Sonic the Hedgehog movies or the games without really being too referential to the games. They were able to do their own spin on. Jim Carrey was able to do his own spin on the Dr. Robotnik character. In the game, he's very different. And in the movie, they turned him into a very traumatized orphan who was kind of acting out his trauma against the world, and that was fun and that was interesting. And I think it's all about capturing the feel, because one of the biggest criticisms of the Halo Paramount Plus show is that it really didn't feel like Halo much at all. It only had 2 big action sequences. They were very, very short and contained. Master Chief has sex in the TV show, and as far as we know, he's a virgin in the game. So like already there, the vibes are completely thrown off. It's like, why is our hero having sex? Like he should not be interested in any of this. Yeah. So like that for me, like for me personally, I kind of enjoyed the Halo show for how different it was, and they were dramatizing a lot of things, and it was very melodramatic and it was interesting. And it wasn't until Master Chief had a sex scene with a prisoner of war. I don't know if you've seen the show, but
no, I've not watched it.
Yeah, they had a woman who was a human who was on the alien side, and she was a prisoner of war, and then he just goes to her room and just sleeps with her, and you see it, and it's just like, this is extremely jarring. This is like this is nothing like the game at all. And like again, the vibes were completely thrown off for me, and for a lot of people too. Like that was a breaking point for a lot of people, where it's like, okay, this is not the show that this is not a Halo show. And so I think it really is about trying to capture a feeling.
What's the difference in your mind between animation and live action for some of these things? Because I do feel like animation is almost preferable. Certainly has been done better with particularly some of the older properties. Super Mario Brothers movie that's coming out, apparently, again, very good. People seem to be buzzing about it. But which is animated, or the Castlevania show on Netflix, which is much beloved. People like it a lot, and is again, it's animated, but it's based on an older property. I mean, is that a do you think that some of the stigma on animation is going away in terms of things people are willing to watch and give credit to for being quite good?
Yeah, I think the institutions still have a lot of catching up to do. The Oscars, or even the mainstream media, including us in the Washington Post, like we don't cover anime, even though anime is clearly a pop culture phenomenon for the past 2 decades. But we still don't rarely cover anime. It was a huge deal when Goku from Dragon Ball Z during the Macy's Day Parade showed up on the front page of the New York Times. I was like, wow, this is huge. Acknowledgement finally from the Gray Lady. But in terms of the regular pop culture, in terms of like on the ground, boots on the ground, like people, there's a wide acceptance of animation. You see that all over YouTube, where people you don't expect, or you wouldn't typically expect to watch cartoons, are just watching cartoons and loving it, crying over it and everything. And a lot of people love watching those shows with these Twitch streamers and YouTubers as well. So that's one example. But again, like these shows are very popular. They do very well, and they deal with a lot of adult, interesting topics. And part of the strength of animation is that it can portray things that live action can struggle to. It's a lot cheaper to do animation, even though animation is also very expensive and it's a lot of work too. But The Last of Us season 2 we're not going to see that for another 2 years, man. Like It's ridiculous, right? Yeah, right. But that's fine, because this isn't like Seinfeld where they can just like shoot in an apartment and then and just be back. Okay, we'll be back in a couple months with more shows. With animation, it's a little different in that like Castlevania was able to come out like in an annual basis, and that was fun and that was great, and we didn't have to wait too long. So animation does provide a lot of storytelling strength that live action typically doesn't.
And it's easier. I mean, going back to the vibes question, it's easier to capture the vibes of something like Castlevania or Super Mario Brothers in what is closer to its native format, which is animation. Yeah,
video games are animation basically. You need animators. Every video game would need an animator. So
let's talk about the history of video game adaptations for a bit here, because I two things always kind of annoy me. One is when people say, oh well, no video game movie has ever been a success. Like they didn't make 7 Resident Evil movies because they all failed. You
They were
know,
wildly successful.
like it's not. This is you. I don't know what world you live in, but it's not all Uwe Boll adaptations of whatever. There is an actual industry here. But the one that the thing I always forget this until I look at the chart, is that the most successful video game movie of all time, of course, is Warcraft. And that was driven almost entirely by the massive success of that film in China, where it did huge box office. What was it about Warcraft, do you think, that appealed to the Chinese market? And is it interesting to you? Because it's kind of interesting to me that there has been no movement whatsoever on a sequel. Like I don't think we're ever going to get one. Doesn't seem to be happening.
That is fascinating, and it does speak to a lot of the Chinese audience because you can't really account for taste, right? Like it wasn't a very good movie, and but the Chinese audience seems to really love bombastic, special effects laden films. The Transformers movies were famously crazy successful there too. And so I think part of that is also like a lot of people in China love to play fantasy role-playing games. Genshin Impact is a free-to-play role-playing game that is made in China, and it's also extremely popular in China. Chinese audiences, they love mobile games too. So I think, and a lot of those games are based around fantasy. So I do think that World of Warcraft kind of touched on a lot of those, hit a lot of those touchstones of being really special effects laden, being a big Hollywood movie, being, easily shippable and distributable throughout China without any kind of like political messaging that they needed to fix up or anything like that. It was a very clean movie. And it appealed to people who just love like fantasy epics, and even Chinese dramas are very fantasy epic driven, So it does feel like that it kind of catered to them pretty well over there. But it's interesting, and I don't know why there is no sequel. That's a good question. I have no idea why.
Yeah, no, I mean it's part of the problem, I'm sure, is that being a big hit in China is nice, but it's also not great for American-based studios because the Chinese partners keep a much higher percentage of the box office revenue. So like if you make $200 million in China, you're only bringing 20 or 30 million of that back home, which is obviously a problem. But it is interesting. I think about that too much, frankly, considering how bad the movie. Actually, it's not even a bad movie. It's a very weird movie. What did you actually make of Warcraft?
I just didn't like think of it. Like it was fine. Like it wasn't like terrible, but it was just like I don't remember anything from it. Like I watched the Uncharted movie too, with Tom Holland. I don't remember anything from it. A lot of these movies like they just kind of happen, Like they're fine movies. The movies I remember the most are the ones that are really either really bad or really good,
Well, that's another sign of maturation, I think, of the video game as IP, is that most blockbusters are just
fine.
fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Most blockbusters are competent. Like Rampage, competent. It was fine. A nice little star vehicle for The Rock. I enjoyed the 110 minutes or whatever I was in the theater, but I have literally never thought about it since writing and podcasting about it, years ago.
Exactly. Yeah, I watched it. I was like, I was on my phone half the time, it's a movie like Assassin's Creed, which starring Michael Fassbender, which is just so awful. The editing is awful. Like it makes me want to vomit. Like it physically makes me ill. And sometimes there's just movies that just do that. I'm fascinated with this whole recent trend in films of having a biopic about stuff. And one movie that's coming up this week on this Friday on Apple is the Tetris movie. And I would be interested to see more biographical films that look into the creation of a video game.
Well, this is an interesting trend as well, right? So you've got Tetris, but you've also have Mythic Quest. You know, Mythic Quest, the show on Apple TV Plus.
I
Have you
haven't
watched
seen that
Mythic
one.
Quest? Okay, well, so Mythic Quest is great, and it follows folks who are making a like massive MMO RPG. And then you also have, like Silicon Valley, which is kind of in the same-ish world of video games and that sort of stuff. But it's interesting that we are also currently getting a lot of adaptations or originals or whatever about the world of video games in addition to actual video game adaptations.
Yeah, the Tetris movie is fascinating, and it's unique because have you heard of the story behind Tetris?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, yeah. It involves like the KGB and the fall of the fall of Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Union and everything like that. But like even a movie about the creation of like Sonic the Hedgehog or even Super Mario would be interesting. It's a fascinating movie moment in the Tetris movie when the Nintendo General Counsel unveils the Game Boy like it's in like he's Oppenheimer. And those kind of dramatizations were the Tetris movie is really fun because of how it just dramatizes the event of finding Tetris and the unveiling of the Game Boy and the unleashing of the Game Boy upon the world. It makes it really fun, and it gives video games like a really nice shining light within like the history of pop culture in general.
Yeah, it is interesting too. I mean, again, it's that movie is at least 50%, almost a heist movie, like corporate intrigue, heist movie sort of thing. In addition to being about this game that really did, change the world is a big phrase, but it really did.
It sold 500 million copies. That's a lot.
That's a lot. That's a lot. A lot of people played that game. All right, so let's talk. One of the things I mentioned to you before we did the show was a thing I hate is when people say nobody has ever made a good video game movie or show or anything like that. It just is. It is untrue. And while many of them have been bad, there are some good ones out there. Gene, what is your favorite video game adaptation, either for film, TV, or whatever?
It would have to be Castlevania, as we spoke about. I really love, Castlevania is another game where the story was not that important. It's just about a family of dudes who are going to kill Dracula. That's it. Dracula has appeared again every 100 years, and then the descendants of this family have to just got to go to the castle and just kill him. That's it. And they were able to kind of create this entire like Game of Thrones-esque story about like Dracula's war council and like the political intrigue among this world of vampires and how they were trying to backstab each other. It was fascinating stuff, and it was very adult stuff too. That and I also gave Mortal Kombat the best movie Oscar, quote unquote Oscar, because like I feel like it was kind of the first movie to kind of make us feel like it captured that spirit of the game. When I watched it in theaters when I was a kid, and I was like, "This is great. This is the best thing I've ever seen." It's a bit like the that TMNT movie, the very first one, that kind of hewed very close to like the original comics, the inspiration of the comics. Like it felt like a Daredevil movie, in some parts. And like it's more. We need more movies like that, where that capture that energy.
Yeah, I mean, Mortal Kombat was interesting too because I mean, like you would think. I mean, look, we have a whole genre of this sort of movie, the Bruce Lee martial arts tournament.
Mortal Kombat was just copying the Bruce Lee template. That's it.
Yeah, like it. I don't know. I am a sucker. I also saw Mortal Kombat in theaters and remember coming out of it and being like, yes, this is amazing. This is what movies were meant to be.
Yes, exactly. This is what movies are meant to be. To suspend our disbelief. See some cool stuff happen on screen, a lot of cool magic. That's exactly what we want,
I will say, all right, I will. My own pick though for best video game adaptation is actually Silent Hill, which I am very fond of. I think Silent Hill is not a great movie. exactly, but it is a very effective horror movie. It's like got great atmosphere. It's got some great character design. Obviously, borrowed a lot from the video games. I have no idea how closely it hews to the games because I haven't played the games. But just as a movie qua movie, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. Not great, not perfect by any means, but like pretty good.
I liked it too. It was actually a little horrifying. It was actually more horrifying than I expected. You know, it was Silent Hill was not a gory film, but that film it's not a gory game. It's more psychological. But that film was pretty gory. I still remember it to this day, and I do remember that it did capture the vibes pretty well. It was just that the story wasn't that great, you know, and some of the performances were like, you know, like a little off kilter. The main character was a woman. I think I remember that she was the gender of the character changed because it was originally a male, but the director felt that it felt a little weird for a man to be scared. And it's like, okay, well, you know, men could be scared too, especially in the sight of certain horrors that you see in Silent Hill. But okay, so that was an interesting change. But it did actually hew fairly close to the game story, and I think that's why most people it wasn't received critically well when it was released. But I think a lot of people have kind of like Mortal Kombat kind of reevaluated and said, you know what, that wasn't a bad movie. That it did a lot of things really well especially in terms of the visual presentation, the art design, the set design, the special effects, the costuming.
That director is very. I mean, the director is. I think he also did Brotherhood of the Wolf, right?
Yeah, Brotherhood of the Wolf. Yeah. Very stylish movie too.
Right. So he has that whole vibe down. It is good. I will say one of the worst video game movies that I have ever seen was the sequel to Silent Hill. However, the Silent Hill Revelations 3D, which stars Sean Bean and also one of his kids from Game of Thrones was in. I was like, oh man, this is. I remember watching it and thinking like, I hope this is as good as the first. It was not.
Yeah. That's that's another movie I checked out, which is why I said I remember the first Silent Hill movie, you know, because it was interesting. There was a lot of interesting visuals. There were things that it showed you that sticks in your mind, and Revelations did not do that too.
Yeah. Revelations is also funny. I'm sorry. I have my only one thought on Revelations is it's an interesting movie because it's the most boring, blandly shot, like really kind of lazily made movie for 95% of it. Except there's one scene with Malcolm McDowell, who's the guy who was Alex in A Clockwork Orange and has been in a bunch of other stuff. But there's one scene with Malcolm McDowell where like the set actually looks like a real set. And it's like lit kind of interestingly. I was like, oh, somebody came to work that day and was like, I need to impress Malcolm McDowell. That's what's happening.
Exactly.
That's what's happening here.
Yeah, I think that was one of the interesting parts about The Last of Us is that they really did so much production work in terms of actualizing the game world. They created the whole town just for that Bill and Frank episode. They converted an entire abandoned mall into a one-story mall into a two-story mall with 3D effects. But it felt very real. They used a real giraffe for a giraffe scene. So there was a huge appreciation for this mixture of like practical and 3D effects to just make it really sing. And I think people really appreciated the kind of work, the amount of work and care that went into every little detail in the show.
Yeah. Thinking back to The Last of Us and the kind of some of the more linear games that are out there and just ripe for adaptation and exploitation. I have always thought it was slightly weird to say like, oh well, you can never have a good video game movie because I don't know, man. Like there's nothing stopping your average zombie game from being turned into an exciting action movie like God of War. And God of War Ragnarok, like those are big epic fantasy storytelling situations. I don't see any reason why you can't take that material and drill it down to its essence and
God of War is gonna be an Amazon show, right?
Right. So I've always been, I don't know. Video games don't need me to defend them, but I've always been, kind of put off by some of the snobbishness about it. What should studio heads be looking for right now? What should they be out there saying, okay, here's the next thing that we can really adapt and exploit?
I think they're already doing that. I think there are so many video game shows that are being planned right now. It's really kind of ridiculous. We already mentioned God of War, and I think the showrunners there said that they do feel some kind of pressure after The Last of Us to kind of really deliver. And God of War is a very is probably closer to the Thor movies in terms of like presentation and special effects. So that'll be very expensive, and we'll see how much Amazon is willing to spend after the Rings of Power show, which
Yeah.
I absolutely hated. I'm sorry. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
really?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Did you watch them?
I did. I found it. It was very watchable. That's as much. That's as strong as I'm willing to go on those shows. It was watchable.
But God of War doesn't can't not be just fine, like people
Yeah.
will trash if they screw up, especially since so much of God of War is already kind of written out. So I think studios are will be kind of looking for games that are already kind of written out. The Last of Us being probably the prime example, because The Last of Us inspired the God of War. To kind of in its presentation, a lot of PlayStation games are going to be doing that because PlayStation in particular focuses on creating these very cinematic experiences, these cinematic linear experiences. And PlayStation CEO Jim Ryan has told me years ago that they've been working on trying to make the IP work harder for the company. And that's something that Nintendo has able to do. The love for Mario is multi-generational. And that's something that is highly desired among video game companies right now, and nobody really has it. The Xbox tried to do it with Halo, and they've kind of failed at retaining the audience. And PlayStation hasn't really done a ton of work in the past, not until the last 10 years, to kind of cater and build this loyal audience that would be parents and their children would like it too. And part of the problem is that a lot of PlayStation games are very adult games, and Nintendo games are very family oriented. So that's why it's able to be easily multi-generational. But
Yeah.
PlayStation does have a vested interest in translating translating so many of its games. Like there was a game called Ghost of Tsushima, which was a samurai game very inspired by Akira Kurosawa films, and I didn't think that they did a good job in mimicking the Kurosawa films, but that was their intent, and now they want to make that into I think a movie or a TV show, I forget, but it's like so sometimes I don't really see the point, because some of these are just so inspired by the thing that already exists. Like Uncharted doesn't make sense because we already have so many Indiana Jones movies, and they're all amazing.
Right.
Or most of them. And Uncharted, there's nothing about Uncharted that is charismatic enough to translate well to a film. But it plays amazingly as a game. It's a thrill ride as a game. But I don't feel like that the characters of Uncharted are unique and charismatic enough to carry an entire like film franchise.
That's actually a really interesting point too to think about, because you have so many of these, you have so many video games that are kind of disguised knockoffs of something on TV or a movie, and then refracting that back to TV and movie. It's like a photocopy of a photocopy.
Yeah, it's very strange. So that's why The Last of Us is at least a little bit unique. Yeah, obviously it's another zombie show, but it's focused on the intense emotionality of the characters. And Joel himself and Ellie are not really characters that you see a lot in TV, even in The Walking Dead. So that translated well. I think God of War will probably translate pretty well too. There's not a lot of shows about gods who murdered the entire pantheon of Greek mythology. So that will be a lot of fun to watch. It'll be very violent, but you know, uh, it's a pretty compelling story. But
All right. I always like to ask at the end of these interviews if there's anything I should have asked. What do you think folks should know about the state of video game adaptations? What do you think folks at the studio should know about video games? What should people know that I have failed to ask?
no, I think you covered it all. But I think really, what The Last of Us really has. You're right again that The Last of Us is an inflection point where a lot of people will be like, let's look at this. Let's reevaluate what we're doing and see what we could do to kind of mirror this success, because I think a lot of studios are now again under that pressure to create. So many TV shows come out. There's the Fallout TV show. Fallout is a series about post-apocalyptic world that ended in the 1950s. So culture has been kind of an arrested development within 1950s pop culture, and like that kind of thinking, and that's always fascinating to see how America is reflected in the post-apocalypse, but still in when quote unquote America was great again, back then. Um, and what else is there? I don't know. There's like literally like there's Bioshock, which is famously a counter argument for Ayn Rand's books, particularly Atlas Shrugged. So that would be an interesting film or show to see in terms of how political they decide to make it. But yeah, there's just so much, and I think a lot of people are going to be looking at like what The Last of Us did, and I think you're going to see a lot of shows that hew pretty close to the games from now on.
I do wonder if this will be a TV mostly phenomenon, because these games, we're talking about games that run 20, 30, 40 hours in some cases just to get through the main storyline. So like distilling all that down to a 2 or 2.5 hour movie is tricky.
Yeah, I think that's that's one thing that the Halo show got right, and also obviously The Last of Us, is that like the TV format is a lot more similar to video games. Video games are like books, like you can't really sum up a whole book in terms. Lord of the Rings was 3 movies, but they cut out like 60%, of those books, and so I do think that like if you do want to stay close, then it's gonna have to be more episodic content versus a film that tries to capture the spirit of a 40-hour experience or an entire trilogy of games or whatever. Yeah. But it's been interesting to see like book adaptations to comic book adaptations to now video game adaptations, and so we'll see where this goes. But I definitely do think that I think you're right in that we are in the kind of the beginning of some kind of video game transmedia success, and video games have been trying to do that for some time now. The Final Fantasy series in Japan has famously and was pretty ahead of its time in terms of trying to tell transmedia stories. Transmedia as in like cross media. So they would have a movie that would tie into the game, and it's like you have to watch the movie to tie into the game, and it's like that wasn't really successful, mostly because the movies were pretty bad again, and it made the games feel like an empty experience. But I did, and then but you see what happened with Cyberpunk and with Netflix, and that told an entirely new story that was energizing and made the world seem fun, and then Cyberpunk sales went up. And you see that again with The Last of Us, where a lot of people were like, "Oh, I kind of want to play the video game version of this," and the sales went up too. So I think again, like it's about making sure that it captures the vibe of the game. So if you want to go back to the game, you're like, "Oh, this kind of feels like the show too." It needs to definitely be kind of a companion piece together for this kind of transmedia success to be achieved.
Well, and if you go back to 2002, 2003, right? There was the Matrix video game that came out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Enter the Matrix.
I think that came out in between Reloaded and Revolutions,
and that was written by the Wachowskis, and it was canon. Jada Pinkett Smith's character was if you want to understand what the hell she was doing in Reloaded and Revolutions, you have to play the game to do that, and that was an interesting experience too. And again, yeah, that was the Matrix trilogy in general was just way ahead of its time in so many different things. They had an MMO that was also canon too, like Morpheus dies in the MMO, and then like the new movie Matrix 4. I already forget the name of the Matrix 4, but like
Matrix Resurrections.
Yeah, there you go. All these rewords or whatever. Resurrections referenced the what happened in the MMO, which was an incredible little Easter egg. So
and the Animatrix, it's
the Animatrix too. Yeah, that's right.
All formats. Yeah.
They did everything, and it's taken a while for video game companies to kind of get that too, and I think it's starting to happen with Cyberpunk, The Witcher as well, also by CD Projekt Red. I'm trying to pronounce that right in Polish, but CDPR has success with the Witcher series. The Witcher series now is kind of like not doing great right now, but like when it initially launched, it was a huge success for the game, and it resulted in further game sales. And this was an old game. This is a game that came out in 2015, selling well in 2019. So again, like so many people will be looking at this. Like, how can we do that? How can we continue the sales life of a game after it's come out? You know.
Have you seen the sales figures on The Last of Us? Has that seen a big spike?
I haven't. They haven't released any numbers, but it has been topping the PlayStation charts in the past weeks. So it is like the number one like PS4 game, like PS5 game. People are definitely buying it. So I don't know if it's been like a massive success, but it's definitely movie units, and that's what you want. You know, like they want you to buy the game. You know, Neil Druckmann, the series creator, Craig was like, maybe you don't need to buy the game. He's like, no, please buy the game. Yeah. They want you to buy the game. They want the show is made for you to buy the game. And the PC release of The Last of Us is coming out today. And you know it might not have been time to be at the end of the show, but it's perfect timing. And you know I'm sure that a lot of PC players who had never played the game before but watch the show will be like, yeah, I should check this out.
All right, Gene, thank you for being on the show today. I really appreciate it. We'll get you back on here next year once the video game boom is in full swing and everybody is breaking blockbuster records and everything. We'll see how it goes.
Mario Mania from here on out.
Mario, that movie's gonna make. I'm taking my kids. It's the first time they've been in a theater in 3 months. They're so excited. All right, I'm Sonny Bunch. I'm culture editor at the Bulwark. I'm very pleased that you all are hanging out with me and Gene today. I'll be back next week with another episode. We'll see you guys then.